So this is Monopolistic Competition, which is chapter 13. And just to refresh your memory, monopolistic competition on the spectrum of different market types is more competitive than it is monopolistic in nature, but it gets the name monopolistic from the fact a lot of students see monopolistic and think it's more like monopoly. It's actually more like pure competition. It's monopolistic in the fact that firms try to differentiate themselves one from another, usually with some variance in the product that they produce. You might have several firms in an industry that are essentially producing the same thing, but they're a little bit different in some way, and each firm in the industry is just simply trying to outdo the other guy in terms of adding attributes to their product that at least seemingly might make it better in the eyes of consumers. Differentiation can be anything from true product variances to warranties. You know, our warranty might be the same product, but we offer a better warranty for our product than the competitors do. So differentiation can be a lot of things. It is monopoly-like in that, at least as far as these economic models go, it's monopoly-like because they do have the ability to influence price and output in the market. So if you'll recall, in pure competition, there's so many firms producing exactly the same thing with no ability to differentiate that gives them the lack of ability to alter price by changing their output in the market. Whereas in monopolistically competitive markets, they actually do have the ability to a limited extent, but they do have the ability to control price and output in the market. And we're going to talk a lot about this this week and next week when we talk about monopolistic competition, really more so with oligopoly, truthfully. In fact, we used to have this material in the oligopoly chapter, but it is relevant here, so they moved it up in this most recent edition. And that is the degree to which an industry has market power concentration. And what that simply means is how much influence in the market in terms of the ability to influence price and output do a small number of firms have, relatively speaking. And the two different measures of market power concentration are what we call the four-firm concentration ratio and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Lopped off the Hirschman part of it, but it's actually Herfindahl-Hirschman index. The four-firm concentration ratio, I'm not sure if I have that in a second. Don't have a slide for that one, but it's very simple. The four-firm concentration ratio is simply where you take all the firms in an industry, however you identify an industry, and you rank order the firms in an industry from highest to lowest market share. And you simply take the combined total market share of the four largest firms in the industry, and that gives you what we call the four-firm concentration ratio. So for example, if you've got one producer in an industry that controls 20% of the market and his next largest competitor controls 15% of the market, you're up to 35, and the next, maybe the third in line also controls 15, now we're up to 50%. Maybe the fourth largest in the industry controls 10% of the market, just to make up numbers. You'd have a situation where the four largest firms in total controlled 60% of the market share. And that's what we call the four-firm concentration ratio. Truth of the matter is, the four-firm concentration ratio is largely academic, meaning it's not really used, practically speaking, outside of academic publications. You see it in textbooks a lot. But the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is by far the more used and most practical of the two. But you definitely need to know how to calculate both of them. In fact, you'll be calculating at least one, if not both, on this upcoming homework for this next Sunday night. You'll definitely be asked to do one or the other or both on the exam. So just remember, the four-firm concentration ratio is just simply add up the four largest firms' market shares and add them together, and that's the four-firm concentration ratio. There's no magic number. I think your author says something like, generally speaking, if the four firm concentration ratio for an industry is 40 or below, most economists would consider that monopolistically competitive market. I would agree, but that's kind of a gray area. There's a lot of debate probably about that, but I'd say that's probably not a bad number. Certainly anything, you start getting to where 50% of the market is controlled by only four firms in an industry, regardless of how many firms there are in an industry, then you're definitely getting into the territory of what we would call an oligopolistic industry. How do these two market power measures differ? The Herfindahl-Hirschman index is calculated where you take the market share of every firm in an industry, square it, and then add them together. So it's the sum of the squares of the market shares of all firms in the industry. Sorry. So you take, and this is for every firm in the industry, not just the largest four. In fact, probably the most common mistake that students will make on this upcoming exam is that they'll kind of mix the two together and confuse the two. It's very common that I'll see students will square just the largest four firms and add them together and call that the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or HHI for short. That is not correct. To calculate the HHI, you actually have to square all of the firms in an industry, no matter how many there are, and add them together. So if you think about it, if there was literally a monopoly where only one firm produced all the output in an industry, what would their market share be? What percent of the total market would they have? It's not a trick question. 100%, right? They'd have 100% of the market. What's 100 squared? 10,000. So the highest point I'm making is the highest possible Herfindahl index you could have would be 10,000, and that would literally be a monopoly. Of course, we know, you've heard me say it many times now, that monopolies don't literally exist. But if it did, it would have a Herfindahl-Hirschman index of 10,000. You go to the opposite extreme where there's so many firms in an industry that they each have just such a tiny market shares. Each firm in an industry has 0.01% of the total market share in an industry. If you square that and add all those together, you're going to get a really small number, right? So theoretically, the Herfindahl index could never literally be 0, but it's effectively, it might as well be 0. So a low of 0 for all intents and purposes up to a high of 10,000. So that's the only possible range you could ever have a Herfindahl index in. Why is this the favored market power measure in reality? Well, if you think about it, what this does is by squaring each firm's market share, a square of a larger number is going to have more impact in terms of its ability to impact market and market price and output. So by squaring the larger firms, squaring them all, those firms that have large market shares would impact that value more. So it's considered to be a better measure of the true ability of one or a small group of firms to control price and output in the market. Frequently get asked, I'm not even sure your author addresses this one, even in the next chapter, which is kind of surprising considering it says 40% or more is oligopolistic on the Ford market, or the Ford firm concentration ratio, but he doesn't really address the Herfindahl index. Generally speaking, and this is somewhat frustrating to students, it's not really so much what the HHI is, it's how it will change potentially based on some significant event in the marketplace. And what I mean by that is if you've got an industry where the Herfindahl index is, say, 2,000, that's a fair degree of market power concentration, believe it or not. That would definitely be considered an oligopolistic industry. But let's say you had the two, even in that industry, the two largest firms controlled, say, each 20% of the market, which may not seem like a lot, but just those two firms together would control 40% of the market, correct? Well, if you square 20, you get 400, correct? So if you had 400 twice, 400 plus 400 is 800, of course. Well, if those two firms were to merge, what would the impact be on the HHI index? Well, now all of a sudden, if you've got two firms that independently control 20% of the market, and they now control 40% of the market, 40 squared is 1600, right? So that would have a very large impact on the HHI, which is why I say the number itself is not so much what we're concerned with. It's changes in the number that get the attention. So this is not just an academic measure. This is something that actually gets practical use in our economy, primarily by the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission of the United States will measure and look at the HHI index of a lot of different industries. And there's some reasons why, like we talked about at the end of the monopoly chapter, just because monopolies are bad doesn't mean we would necessarily want to abolish them because maybe there's a good reason for some monopoly power and significant barriers to entry exist that we still want that good or service that they provide, but we don't like the market power that comes with it, so maybe we regulate that way. In a highly oligopolistic industry, or even in an industry that might not be considered oligopolistic, the act of a potential merger will get the attention of federal regulators. In fact, we hear a lot about that right now in the news with, what are the two? I can never remember the cell phone companies, but what is it? AT&T and it's not Sprint, I don't, T-Mobile. AT&T and T-Mobile wanted to merge. You hear about that in the news a lot. In fact, they just ruled that actually it's been a few weeks ago now, time flies, but the Federal Trade Commission and FCC got involved because it's a communications industry, but they ruled that they could not merge. It wouldn't be in the public's interest for those two to merge, but they're still fighting it in court. And so, you think about the cell phone industry, and I think we can all agree that's a pretty highly market power concentrated industry, right? I mean, there's not really all that many cell phone companies. I mean, it seems like there's a lot to choose from with a lot of the smaller providers, but especially when you look at the infrastructure related to cell phone communication, there's only 3 cell phone companies that control every single cell phone tower in the United States, right? Y'all know that, right? So just because you have Straight Talk or Cricket or some crazy, they're bad services, but I'm just saying, you have all these small companies like Straight Talk and Cricket, and I don't know, there's probably a million of them out there. They're all using the network or the backbone of the infrastructure created by 3 different, it's my understanding, well, AT&T and Verizon for sure, but Sprint also owns some of the telecommunications infrastructure. So when these other small companies provide service to us and sell us service, when we pay our bill to them, they're paying, kind of like I said last time when we talked about regulatory issues related to public utilities. We have a choice in electricity in our homes now, but it all flows through the DP&L backbone or the network that DP&L provides, and because of that, DP&L gets a line lease charge. Well, it's the same thing in the cell phone industry. So anyway, they prevented, at least to this point, they prevented the two very large cell phone companies from merging because that would just create way too much market power in the hands of too few people. It's already a highly concentrated market power situation anyway. So again, this one does get practically used. It gets practically used in that way. Like I say, the Federal Trade Commission actually does pay attention to the HHI index for hundreds of different industries, especially those that really do have a high degree of market power. And again, they're not so concerned with what the index is necessarily. It's just what would be the result of two companies, one firm taking over another firm, maybe in hostile takeover or something like that, or when two firms want to merge, like in the case of the cell phone companies, what would be the impact of that? Well, a real good way to measure that is to be what would change, how much would that change the HHI index? So generally speaking, if you had to put a number to it with the HHI index, I'd say somewhere around 1,500 is generally anything, anything under 1,500, certainly under 1,400, it's not really going to get the attention of regulators. Not too much going to be on their radar screen unless something significant were to happen. It's when you get over the 1,500 mark that they really start to pay attention to that. And I mean, there are industries where the HHI index is 4,000. And we allow those industries to exist because there might be good reasons why. There's just not the ability to create any significant degree of competition in those industries. So just to put a bow on it, make sure you guys can differentiate how to calculate the two. And we'll probably look at some of those Wednesday too as we practice for the exam. All right. So this is the market model for monopolistic competition. And one of the hardest things for students to overcome early on, I like to point out the pitfalls as early as I can, is when you see this market, remember we're looking at every one of these market models that we've been looking at, starting with pure competition, and we made the leap to monopoly, and now we're looking at monopolistic competition. I've said this a number of times, we're always looking at this market, this industry, from the perspective of one producer in that industry. So this is what the industry looks like from one firm's perspective that's in this business. And so when you see that demand curve that's downward sloping like that, your tendency is going to want to be to think, well, that's the market demand curve. Understandable, since when we just got done looking at monopoly, the monopolists, because they were the only firm producing in an industry, that was the market demand curve, right? They're the only firm producing in the industry, therefore the demand curve for the entire industry was their demand curve. Well, now you see a downward sloping demand curve, you think, okay, there's the industry demand curve again. This demand curve does not represent the industry demand curve, because now, remember, we're talking about still now a relatively large number of producers. So there's a lot of producers in this industry producing whatever this good or service is. Think of that demand curve that you see on the slide right now as the share of the market that this one firm controls. So think of that demand curve as this firm's market share. It's still a downward sloping demand curve, unlike in pure competition. Remember, in pure competition, the demand curve was perfectly elastic because the firm operating in pure competition was stuck selling whatever quantity of output they wanted to at the market determined price. Well, now here, this is their market share, but it is downward sloping, indicating that if they want to produce and sell more output, they can do so, but in order to do so, they're going to have to lower the price. So that's much more like the monopoly market model. So just remember that this demand curve, when you're looking at purely competitive markets, that demand curve is not the entire market demand curve. It's the market share of this one firm that's operating in that. I think if you get over that hurdle, the rest of it becomes pretty similar to everything that we've talked about so far. So if you take a starting situation like this, and I'm getting away from the exact numeric values that we've been looking at to this point, so this is just really a more generic slide. By now you should be comfortable with how we interpret these graphs anyway. So if I were to show you a situation like this and say how much would this producer produce, I would hope, and if not by now you need to get comfortable with this, immediately your focus should go to the marginal cost and marginal revenue curves, right? Because we've harped so many times, and I've said a million times, we're not going to change that profit maximizing rule. It's always the same rule regardless of what type of firm and what industry we're talking about. So all firms will maximize their profit if they produce where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal. So that's right there where that yellow dot is. And remember, that tells you how many to produce. And so from that intersection point, you follow that straight down vertically to the x-axis. And so this firm should be producing Q1, whatever that value is. That's the amount that they should be producing. And if they do that, they'll maximize their profit. So at that quantity of Q1, you go up. Remember, you got to go all the way up to the demand curve to determine the price. The demand curve tells you the price. The marginal revenue does not tell you the price. In fact, that's kind of the key point we made when we when we made the leap to monopoly, price and marginal revenue are no longer the same thing. They were in pure competition, but they're not now. So at that Q1 quantity, you got to go all the way up to the demand curve to determine what price they would charge at that output level. Well, if they're producing Q1 output, the demand curve says they would sell that at price P1. Does everybody see that? I know it's obvious when I point it out up here on the graph, but you'd be surprised how quickly that falls apart when you get in front of an exam and you panic and you don't know what you're looking at. So make sure you always remember that the demand curve tells you what the price is. So if they get price P1, are they making a positive economic profit or not? Well, you always compare that to the average total cost curve at that same output. So at Q1, at that output, their average total cost, wherever that Q1 quantity intersects that average total cost curve, it's lower than the price, right? So their average total cost per unit is less than the price they're receiving per unit. So obviously they are making a positive economic profit in this scenario, correct? How much, that vertical distance is their per unit profit, how much their total profit is would be whatever that vertical distance is, P1 minus A1 times Q1. Remember, profit's always a rectangular area on this graph. So in this initial scenario, firms, and we assume that all firms, remember this is a large number of firms. So a lot of firms that have this similar type situation. Now, obviously not all firms have the same exact cost structure. Not all firms are literally going to be charging the same price, but for simplicity, if you were to assume there's, 1,000 different firms doing the same thing or 100 different firms doing the same thing, if an industry has economic profits like we saw in pure competition, especially in the long run in pure competition, other firms want to enter the industry, right? Well, the barriers to entry are low in a monopolistically competitive market model. So it's not very hard for firms to get into or out of the industry. In fact, it's, for all intents and purposes, it's very much like pure competition. People can get in and out at will. And just like what we saw happen at the end of chapter 10, when there's economic profits to be made in an industry, firms will want to enter that industry, correct? So in this scenario, people on the outside looking in are going to want a piece of that action, so to speak. So they're going to enter the industry. When firms enter the industry, what do you think happens to the market share of the firm? Like, assume you're this firm. Before firms started entering the industry, that demand was your market share. If more firms enter the industry, is your market share going to go up or down? Down, right? That's pretty obvious. You don't need an econ class to tell you that. So your market share is going to go down or decrease. How do we reflect a decrease when we talk about demand? How would we illustrate a decrease in demand for something?
A leftward shift.
Yes, the demand curve is going to shift to the left, correct? Now, I'm not sure your author makes this. He definitely makes that point, but not sure if he makes this point or not. But not only is that demand curve going to shift to the left, but it's going to shift to the left, and it's actually going to get flatter. It's going to get more elastic in nature. And the easy way to remember that is to think about, as competition increases, what does the demand curve in a purely competitive market look like? It's perfectly elastic, right? It's perfectly horizontal. So as competition increases, definitely the demand curve is going to shift to the left. That's the most important thing you need to know about this model. But it's also going to shift to the left, and it's going to get a little flatter. So it's going to shift to the left, and it's going to become, the slope is going to decrease. If you have a scenario like this, the opposite, again, let's use this as a starting point. If we have a scenario like this, first thing your eye should be drawn to is, where's marginal revenue and marginal cost equal? In this graph, it's a quantity Q2. At that quantity Q2, you go all the way up to the demand curve, and you see they can sell that at a price of P2. But here, that price is now less than the average total cost. And if the price is less than the average total cost, now they're losing money per unit, correct? They're paying more per unit that they sell than they're able to generate in revenue for that unit. So they have an economic loss here. The total size of that loss is that vertical distance between the price minus average total cost, of course, would be a negative number indicating it's a loss, times Q2 would give you this yellow rectangular area that would represent their economic loss. Well, the exact opposite's going to happen then, right? In industries or when firms are making economic losses, firms leave the industry. Again, it's easy to get in and out of this industry, so firms are going to leave. And again, putting yourself in the perspective of this one producer, if you're this producer and you remain in the industry and firms leave, then your market share is going to increase, correct? The exact opposite is going to happen. This demand curve is going to shift to the right, and in fact, it's going to get a little steeper. Again, when they shift to the left, I think it gets flatter. When it shifts to the right or increases, it's going to get a little steeper. And so that would happen. And as long as there are economic profits, as long as there's economic profits, firms will enter the industry and the profits will get smaller. If there's economic losses, firms will leave the industry and those losses will get smaller until, just like in Chapter 11 in long run pure competition, there was no longer an incentive for firms to enter or exit the industry, and that was a long run equilibrium condition. And this is long run equilibrium in monopolistically competitive markets. Note that the demand curve has become just tangent to the average total cost curve. And that is your clue that is long run in monopolistically competitive markets. But more importantly, look at the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost. In this graph, it's now Q3. And if you follow that up to the demand curve, it's that price right there, which is P3. But that also happens to be the point of tangency. So that's the same exact, whatever that price is exactly what the average total cost is. So if price is equal to average total cost, then obviously there's not a positive economic profit, there's not a negative economic profit, there's zero economic profit. And just like in pure competition, remember, zero profit does not mean, zero economic profit doesn't mean firms will leave an industry. They're making a normal profit still. So there's no incentive for firms to leave or enter the industry, which is why we call this long run equilibrium. So price ends up being equal to average total cost, which is very similar to the long run outcome in a purely competitive market, right? Price ended up being equal to average total cost there because, just like in this scenario, economic profits disappear or become zero in the long run. Everybody? Now you probably know why I've said a million times that if you don't understand pure competition, you can't understand monopoly. If you don't understand monopoly, you can't understand anything else that happens in between. There is a specific, you would never start with this model, you'd never make sense of it. Would you agree? I think that'd be tough. Any questions about that? All right. So, well, before I go on, let me ask you, are we producing in a productively efficient manner? How do we define productive efficiency? Sorry, I got to record some of the hits here that wasn't here at the beginning. What's productive efficiency? Producing in a least cost way. Remember when we produce at the minimum average total cost? Are we producing at minimum average total cost here? Don't be bashful. Are we producing at the lowest average total cost we could be producing at? Seth says no, he's just too bashful to speak up and say it.
Anytime I say anything, I'm always wrong.
What does your shirt say? What does that say?
Reptenberg starting gates. You know, Miami Valley, how they do the
oh, yeah.
Races. Yeah, my boss does that.
They make them?
They make the gates, the carts and stuff.
That's right. We are not producing in a productively efficient manner because we're not producing at the lowest cost on the average total cost curve. How do I know that? Well, We choose to produce at Q3. Remember, we always assume rational behavior. Any firm in any type of market is always going to produce where they can maximize their profit, even if that maximum economic profit is 0. But the lowest point on the average total cost curve is right there where my mouse pointer is. How do I know that?
From marginal cost intersects average total.
Yeah, because where the marginal cost curve intersects the average total cost curve, remember I've said that a million times too, probably. Where that intersection occurs, right there where my mouse pointer is, that is the lowest point on the average total cost curve. So to produce at at the minimum average total cost, goes down here on the x-axis, I'd have to be producing way over here, pretty far to the right of what we're currently producing at, right? So clearly we're not producing in a productively efficient manner. Does everybody see that now? All right. Are we producing in an allocatively efficient manner? How do we define allocative efficiency? How do we define it, and then how do we identify that point? To be allocatively efficient, we are, you could say it a couple of ways. Definition of allocative efficiency is, from society's perspective, we are allocating the right amount of resources to the production of this good. That's how we would define it. How do we identify it? We identify it as the intersection of marginal cost and marginal benefit, or to put it in the context of this graph, what curve on here is the representation of marginal benefit? Talked about this way, I think, actually even in chapter 1, believe it or not. Right at the end of chapter 1, if I'm not mistaken. But definitely we talked about it in chapter 3.
Is it the demand curve?
It is the demand curve. Yeah, demand is a representation of marginal benefit. In fact, when early in chapter 3, when your author was defining demand, he was talking about why is the demand curve downward sloping. Well, diminishing marginal utility is one of the reasons why the demand curve is downward sloping. That's just a fancy way of saying every time we consume one more unit of something, we don't get as much satisfaction from the next unit as we did the unit before it, which is why the demand curve is downward sloping. So the demand curve is a reflection of marginal benefit. Marginal cost, of course, is on here, right? That's the red marginal cost curve. So where those two are equal, in other words, where marginal benefit and marginal cost are equal, or in the context of this graph, where demand and marginal cost are equal, and that would be right there where my mouse pointer is now, right? So we should be producing whatever that quantity of output is to be allocatively efficient. So not only are we not productively efficient, clearly we're not producing there. So not only are we not productively efficient by producing in the least cost way, we're not allocatively efficient either. We're not producing where marginal benefit and marginal cost are equal. And because of that, we suffer deadweight losses. We talked about deadweight losses in here a number of times. So why am I emphasizing that? Well, because if you, I'm sure I have a slide about that. I don't. If you were to compare that to in long run equilibrium in purely competitive markets in chapter 11, where we end up producing in the long run is not only are we producing where price is equal to average total cost, but importantly, it's equal to the lowest average total cost, right? Because our demand curve is perfectly horizontal. So we're producing in a productively efficient manner, and we're producing in an allocatively efficient manner in pure competition. Because price ends up being equal to the lowest average total cost, it also ends up being equal to marginal cost. So price equals marginal cost equals average minimum average total cost is the long run outcome in purely competitive markets. This is long run outcome in monopolistically competitive markets, and clearly we don't have either one of those two things. We're we're not producing in a productively efficient manner, and we're not producing in an allocatively efficient manner. And just like we saw in pure monopoly last week, because of that, that's an outcome that is to the disadvantage of society. Why? Because we get less of it and we pay more for it. So just like the monopoly outcome, we don't get as much as we want, and what we do get, we end up paying more for it. And we suffer dead weight losses as a result of it. All right, so this next slide just says what I took a fair amount of time to say, but just to restate what I just said, except for the last bullet point. The last bullet point says we have excess capacity, and that is one of the attributes of monopolistic competition, is that existence of excess capacity. What does that mean? Well, excess capacity means that we could be producing in a productively efficient manner. Because you go back one, this firm can choose this. This is their cost structure and their demand, their price. They can produce anywhere on this quantity spectrum they want to. So they could be producing over here where we're at the lowest average total cost, meaning being productively efficient. They just choose not to because maximizing their profit is more important to them than minimizing their average total cost. Does that make sense? I mean, if you're a firm and you had to choose, I know it seems a little bit counterintuitive maybe, all things being equal, all things being equal being important, would a firm want to minimize their costs? Well, yes, absolutely, all things being equal. Well, all things aren't equal here, right? In order for them to minimize their cost, they would have to sacrifice profit to do that. So things are not definitely equal here. So given the choice, a firm is definitely going to choose to maximize their profit over minimizing their cost. But the point is, they could produce over here if they wanted to. If they wanted to be productively efficient and be the hero, they could produce over there. But if they did that, they would lose money. And that's not rational behavior. And we always assume rational behavior. So the fact that they could produce here at Q4, where they actually would minimize their average total cost, but they choose to produce at Q3 instead, well, that's the less output from our perspective, right? So from society's perspective, we're getting less of this thing. We're also paying a little more for it. That excess capacity is important because what that says is this firm, and remember, this is one firm among still quite a few firms. So this firm and a lot of other firms that are operating like this, they're all going to have excess capacity in their system. And what does that mean, really? Well, what that means is they've got resources that could be employed and being used to produce more output, but they're not being because they just want to maximize their profit. Again, nobody can blame, I'm not knocking profit, nobody blames them for it. It's just a reality of the outcome in this situation. And so you take this one firm and you add it to 100 other firms that all have this excess capacity. There's a lot of resources that are sitting there in our society being unused that have the ability to produce stuff, but they're not being used to produce stuff because they're trying to maximize their profit. And that's probably the biggest way, it is the biggest way that a deadweight loss manifests itself in a monopolistically competitive market. The vast majority of that deadweight loss occurs because you've got, remember, deadweight loss means we're not employing resources efficiently. Here, specifically, when we underproduce, remember back to that chapter 4, when we talked about deadweight losses, when we're not producing as much as we could, we're under allocating resources to the production of something. So the largest manifestation of this this deadweight loss is caused by the excess capacity of our system. And that's not good. From an economic perspective, that's not good. You know, I'm not saying profits are bad. That makes sense to everybody? Price not equal to marginal cost. Obviously, that's just another way of saying we're not allocatively efficient, but really it's the excess capacity that causes the deadweight loss that we're concerned with. Oh, here it is. I thought I had a slide in there. It just wasn't where I thought it was. So this is to compare and contrast the two long run scenarios of monopolistic competition on the left and pure competition on the long run. Again, to highlight these differences, just make sure you understand that in chapter 11 or in pure competition, if you want to combine 10 and 11 together, in the long run, price equals lowest average total cost and marginal cost. So we're both productively and allocatively efficient. And here we don't achieve either of those things. So you should be able to identify very quickly on an exam if shown a graph, is it a monopolistically competitive market or not? And why that is, now this will kind of come together when we look at oligopoly because it looks altogether different. So right now we've seen, to this point now, we've seen 3 of the 4 market structures that we've identified. We looked at pure competition, and then we made the leap all the way to the opposite extreme of pure monopoly. Those 2 market models look very different. And now we have monopolistic competition that looks like this. And this looks different from either one of those 2. I didn't put the monopoly outcome on here. Probably should at some point that actually, maybe we'll do that on Wednesday. But how would monopoly differ from this long run monopolistically competitive market? What would be the real clue if I were to show you the monopoly model on here? How would you differentiate? Because it doesn't look that different, right? What would be your clue that you were looking at a monopoly market rather than a monopolistic competition? Because they look so similar. In fact, those are the 2 market models that students will confuse on the exam. Pure competition is easy because it's the only one that has a perfectly elastic demand curve, right? So that's a piece of cake. Oligopoly, when we get to that next week, you'll see why that one's pretty easy to identify. It's the more complex of the market models by far, but it's the easiest one to identify visually. So what about this graph on the left, this monopolistically competitive graph, tells you that that cannot be long-run monopoly? Yes.
Average total cost has to be below demand.
There you go. Yeah, absolutely. They have profit in the long run in pure monopoly, right? Very good. So in the long run, there is a positive economic profit in monopoly. Well, clearly here there's 0 economic profit. So that's the big difference between the monopoly outcome and the monopolistic competition outcome, because they do look so similar. It's just long run monopoly, the price does indeed end up being above the average total cost. So there's an economic profit. Here that doesn't exist, obviously.
Would that be like a perfect short run market though, right there, that one?
Actually, this is long run as well. Could be a short run situation, but this is ultimately for all of these models, what we get to is what does the long run equilibrium look like? For whatever reason, he decided he needed another chapter to do that with long run. So this was the long run outcome in pure competition. The long run outcome in pure monopoly was that there was positive economic profits. Price was always greater than average total cost. This is long run, and it's specifically long run because the economic profit disappears. Remember, if this were a truly monopolistically competitive industry and economic profits existed, then that wouldn't be a long run scenario because firms would get into the industry, right? So the industry would be expanding, which is what makes it not a long run scenario. If there were losses in this industry, then firms would leave the industry. It's only when there's no more entry or exit in the industry can you consider it to be a long-term scenario. So this is long-term for sure. In monopoly, long-term, easy because it's almost immediately long-term if you think about it, because literally there's no competition. The industry is not going to expand or contract unless the monopolist, for some reason, demand is what it is. The producer doesn't have control over demand. They try and influence demand with advertising, and that's something your author talks about in this chapter. In fact, I probably shouldn't have just glossed over that. Another attribute of monopolistic competition is that because of product differentiation, now all of a sudden there is an advantage to producers advertising their product, right? In fact, it's specifically because they want to try and influence their market share that firms will advertise their product. In truly, purely competitive industries, firms don't advertise, right? When's the last time you saw an advertisement for a farmer out out in Greenville advertising his corn because his corn's better than the farmer in Phillipsburg. Right? Yeah, it just doesn't happen. So advertising is a common component. I mean, obviously lots of different types of industries advertise their products, but in monopolistic competition, advertising is one of the key ways they try and influence market share and try and get consumers to want their product. Another thing about in pure, to compare and contrast these two models, and another reason why it can be difficult for students to identify which is which on an exam, as a hint, in pure monopoly, we did not end up producing in a allocatively or productively efficient manner either. So that's very similar. We didn't produce in a least cost way in this market model or in the monopoly market model, nor did we achieve allocative efficiency in either one. The demand curves are downward sloping in both. The marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve in both. So truly the only difference between these two, even though they're far apart on the spectrum of markets, if you think about it, I've said that the pure competition market model is the easiest one to identify. It's the only one that has a perfectly elastic demand curve, and the oligopoly market will be very easy to identify because it has what we call kink demand curve, and we'll get to that next week and just describe why that is. But my point is, think about on that market spectrum, the two that are most difficult to identify are monopolistic competition, which is a whole lot of producers. It's more toward pure competition, not pure, but it's monopolistically competitive, very large number of producers, and pure monopoly, which was the exact opposite extreme. So they're pretty far apart on the market spectrum, but difficult visually to identify, and that does tend to trip up students a fair amount. So make sure you understand what the similarities between monopolistic competition and monopoly are, but what the key primary differences, and that is the existence of positive economic profits in monopolies and not in monopolistic competition.